This video is meant to discuss some of the aspects of the context of school. One of the most important things when we think about school within the United States is the connection it has to the idea of intelligence. So I just want to briefly mention two of the major theories of intelligence, because which theory we go with is really going to impact how school looks. So the first is the idea that there's a general IQ, that there's a general one type of intelligence out there, and that it might be made up of some small subparts like the little blue circles on the left, but overall those subparts really feed into one general bigger intelligence level, which is the pink circle on the left. This theory basically says that a person is either smart or not. The other theory is the specific IQ approach, and this is really manifest in Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences theory, which says that there are 8 kinds of intelligence, and those are listed in the circle on the right. And you can see that they range from a lot of different things, like what we consider to be smarts, like mathematical smarts or science smarts, to things like musical smarts or people smarts. So this theory says that everybody has some kind of intelligence. Some people have numerous of these, some people might just have one, but that most of us are smart in certain ways and less smart in other ways. So when you think about how school is set up, which of these two really is being emphasized? Well, we'll see that school really is focused on the idea on the left, that either a person is smart or not. The other thing that we do with the idea of intelligence is we put people into boxes. So this is a normal distribution. A normal distribution is basically a curve that represents how many people fall at different levels. So on the bottom we have the range of intelligence from severe mental retardation to genius. And where the curve is the highest represents the places where most people fall. So you can see that the curve is the highest in the center, and that's where average is. So most people are average, and then as you move away from this center either direction, you see that there are fewer and fewer people. So there are fewer slow learners and fewer fast learners than there are average people. And then in the tails there's just very few severely retarded or mentally deficient individuals and just a very few genius individuals. The challenge here is that oftentimes children will get one of these labels in school quite early on. Maybe they do well at reading or they have a hard time reading, and they're either told that they're gifted or that they're a slow learner. And that label can stick and actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy, where children have been told that they're not good at learning, then they stop trying particularly hard and then don't appear to be very gifted intellectually, where they might actually be. They just haven't had the proper motivation, or they haven't had a situation where a teacher has seen what was good about them and was able to pull that out. So there are some real challenges with the way that we think about intelligence because of this labeling, because we put people into boxes. Often one of the ways you get put into a box, other than just what your teacher notices about you, is based on your IQ tests or your standardized tests. So when I was a kid, we took the Iowa tests of basic skills, and those tests came back and told you what percentile you fell in, and that percentile told you what percentage of people scored lower than you versus higher than you. So if you were to score in the 75th percentile in math, for example, that meant that you scored better than 75% of students, and 25% of students scored better than you. But again, this really feeds into the idea of putting children into boxes, because not all children do well on tests, first of all. And secondly, testing isn't necessarily the most valid or reliable way to get at a student's knowledge or skill set. So there are some criticisms of IQ testing. First, like we've talked about, is that the results often put people into boxes. They put labels on people, and that these become self-fulfilling prophecies because we build them into our identity and start to expect ourselves to either be slow or to be gifted. But there's also cultural biases in tests. So standardized tests are one of the hard things to write because you're trying to write one test that would fit everybody. But of course everybody comes to the plate with a different set of experiences. This is true for even the people who write the tests. And demographically, people who write standardized tests tend to be quite well educated, fairly rich, white men. And that's not to say that that group of people is bad, it just means that they write tests based on their experiences of being a well-off white guy. But of course there are a lot of people who take those tests who aren't well-off white guys. There are a lot of cultural minorities, there are a lot of women, there are a lot of people who haven't had access to a lot of great education. So the kinds of test questions that a well-off white guy is going to write might not apply to people who are, let's say, Hispanic women, because they have different sets of experiences. Another kind of cultural bias that sometimes we see a struggle in the testing world is just what language the test is written in. It's becoming more common for children to be able to take IQ tests in maybe their native language if they're immigrants to the United States, but that hasn't always been the case. If you were to take a test in a language that you didn't understand, you would score pretty poorly, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're stupid. It simply means that there's a bias in the test that's keeping you from showing your knowledge. Some of the most interesting research into the issue of intelligence came from a woman named Carol Dweck, and she's proposed that there are two different models of IQ, or two different models of intelligence that people hold. Either an entity model or an incremental model. And basically what she's talking about here is a person's schema about how their brain works. The entity model of IQ basically is when a person feels like you're either born smart or you're born not smart, and that's just the way that it is, and there's not a lot that you can do about it. Someone who has an incremental model of intelligence, however, would understand that the brain is flexible and that your brain's ability is reflective of how many new connections you can make, so that if you tried really hard in a particular area, you could show improvement. So again, the entity model is that you either are smart or you're not. The incremental model is the idea that you can grow because your brain is plastic or flexible and it can make new connections. Some people just naturally have an entity model and some people have an incremental model. But what she did is she looked at small children and saw that the kids who had the incremental model tended to do better in school. So she wanted to run an experiment to see if you could train children to develop an incremental model and if that training would help them improve their school scores or their school performance. So in her experimental classroom, she went in and talked to the children about the brain. In particular, what she did was emphasized how the brain is flexible and how it can make new connections, and that it's like a muscle that can get stronger if you use it a lot, or it can get weaker if you don't use it a lot. So that was the incremental model. The control condition was a different classroom where she went in and talked about the brain, but didn't emphasize the idea that the brain was flexible and that could grow. So then what she wanted to do is to see how these children's perceptions of their intelligence impacted their scores across time. And what she found is that children who learned about the brain being flexible, like a muscle that could get stronger, did better than the kids who hadn't learned that. So Dweck's approach is that an incremental model of intelligence actually leads to better school performance because we have this perception that our intelligence could change if we try hard enough. This also relates to learning motivations. In school, we oftentimes see some children who have mastery motivations and some children have performance motivations. And the unfortunate reality is that more and more students these days are having performance orientations. So a performance orientation is when the focus of education is getting a good grade, where the whole reason or the whole motivation to work hard is to get a certain score or a certain grade on assignments or across a semester or a quarter. Mastery orientation is when a child is motivated to learn simply for the sake of learning, because they enjoy knowing things and they enjoy discovering new information. Of these two, children with mastery orientation actually do tend to perform better, ironically. So if you think about the issue of whether parents pay children for their grades, what that does is it creates a reinforcement of money for scoring well, and that makes the score the most important thing about school for children. So most developmental psychologists would say that for the most part, paying children for grades is not the greatest of ideas because you're not developing the best motivation, and that is the mastery orientation motivation, where kids are learning simply because they enjoy to learn. Finally, I want to talk about the difference between apprenticeship education and schooling education. So through a lot of human history, people learned skills or jobs through apprenticeships. What that meant is that as a young age, they went and worked hands-on directly with the people doing the skill they were going to eventually be doing for work. So for example, if you had someone who was a woodworker, then a child would go on as an apprentice to eventually become a woodworker and learn across multiple years, first the basic skills and then start to get to do some of the more elaborate skills, and the master woodworker that this child was working with would help scaffold the skills or model the skills that were needed. Of course, we do school very differently now. There's very little apprenticeship anymore. We now do schooling. And this was a reflection of the idea that now everybody should get education. So apprenticeship was around in a time when not everybody got the same amount of education, but at some point in history we decided that we do want to try and get all children schooled or all children educated. And that's where school came about. So school is sort of a mass education system that is trying to meet the needs of every single child. Of course, there's such huge variety in children that this becomes really hard, and oftentimes school doesn't meet the needs of very many children very well because it's trying to do such a huge job. I want to talk about some of the assumptions of our current model of school because these are interesting things to think about. So the entire schooling system now is based on things like the idea that all kids should learn at the same pace. So children who are in the first grade have 9 months to learn the skills that you should learn in the first grade, and then they all finish at the same time at the end of the school year and then start the next level the following school year. Is this really the best way? Some kids are slower, some kids are faster. Another idea we have is that kids should learn with same-age children, so everybody within a first grade class is about the same age. The other option would be to have classrooms where there were children from lots of different ages in the same group, and that maybe the older children helped the younger children learn, and that when those younger children became the older children, it was their job to teach the kids below them. And there is something to be said about learning from teaching. I know from my personal experience, I've learned a huge amount because I've taught, and I didn't know that from actually going to school myself. We also assume that children should learn from teachers. A lot of education historically has been very teacher-driven. There's a movement now, though, to make child-centered education more common, and this is where the teacher is there to help support the child's learning, but not to dictate the learning for the child. It's also the case that kids sometimes might actually learn really well from other kids, and not just from older people. Since the No Child Left Behind law came into being, we have really emphasized the assumption that standardized tests reflect student knowledge and abilities well. And of course, there's a lot of criticisms of standardized tests, but as we as a country talk about changes to education, this issue of standardized tests has really remained in the conversation as something that it appears will stick around for a fair amount of time. But think about what we talked about with the tests a little bit earlier. Are these really the best way to reflect student knowledge and ability? Another assumption is that math, science, and language should be the emphasis of school. It's definitely the case that these three areas get a majority of funding. So when you think about times when educational funding has been cut, such as recently, what gets taken out? Well, it's not usually math or science or language. It usually is things like music or PE or art classes. And this is really unfortunate when you think about the theory of multiple intelligences, because there are some children for whom arts or music or physical education is the area where they really excel. And when those are taken out of school, you're only leaving the things that they're not that good at, and so school might become daunting and unfun. And that's what we hear from a lot of kids, is the idea that school is really just not fun. But ask yourself, does it really have to be that way? Or are there changes we could make to education so that children did think school was fun and that they were more engaged?